It's October 2020, and you're watching The Lookout, a production of the Division of World Languages and Cultural Studies, here at Minot State University. I'm your host, Samuel Stinson. Our co-host is Robert Kibler, and this week we have a special treat, in that our first guest is going to be Robert Kibler as well. We're going to be talking a little bit about his work with the Naxi in China. And again, I have no introduction. What introduction could I give for Robert Kibler? Words fail me, so I'm going to use someone else's words. Genius, storyteller, orator, original, modern, comic, a man, a figure, invested, efficient, the wise old man, conscious and unconscious, human, critical, artist, chief, the OG, passion, energy, a man of will, great will. Because of his use in many things, time with him is often too short. His spirit lives through others. I give you Robert Kibler.
Well, thank you. I was thinking humbled and broken and with a bad cough, but
yes. How did you get to the Himalayas?
How did I get up amongst the Naxi who live in the southern Himalayas? I had an opportunity, unexpected, to teach in China at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is the graduate school of Beida, which is the Harvard of China, and I took it. I always wanted to go to China. I dreamed of China, even as a child, and I never thought I'd get there, and here was this opportunity, and I said yes. And through the Chinese Academy of Sciences where I worked, we offered graduate level instruction to those who were Chinese and going on to graduate school in America, in writing, in American literature, in British literature. And we did it in 6-week bundles, after which we would have a long holiday to go somewhere. And over the Christmas break, we had a particularly long holiday, like a 2-month holiday. So I just jumped on a train thinking to go as far away from Beijing and an urban Chinese environment as I could get, to get some relief. And I thought to get down to Laos and near Vietnam and Cambodia. And that was my goal. And I did go down to Xishuangbanna, which is a Chinese protectorate on the Laotian border. And, you know, you meet extraordinary people in these extraordinary places. And I won't go through the list of characters other than I met a Polish woman and a German guy who were down there and in this very strange jungle world. And one of them talked about, and we all complained because the Chinese weren't letting anybody into Tibet. But I wanted to go to Tibet, didn't think much of it, but they said, you know, if you go up into the mountains, there's a tribal group called the Naxi who carry on a trade route with the Tibetans. And if you pay them, you can join that trade route and get up into Tibet, even though the Chinese aren't letting Laowai, foreigners, into Tibet. So I thought I'd get up there. And it's a kind of an arduous process to make it up into those mountains. We rented a car. Guy had a car, and I drove up with at the start with an Italian guy from Palermo. And the first stop was Dali, amongst the Bai people. And you should know that the western part of China is all different minority groups, none of whom are Chinese. The Han Chinese are dominant in the middle and in the southwestern sections and up into the mountains, including Tibet, you've got the 56 different tribal nationalities or ethnic groups. So we stopped with the Dai people and we got a place to stay there, me and this waiter from Palermo. And he made enough money in 9 months of waiting tables to spend the next 3 months just traveling the world. So we were in Dali amongst the Bai people, and the next stop was to try and get up to the Naxi people, and he couldn't make it. The altitude got to him, and I left him in a bed one day. He said, well, okay, I'm heading on. He said, good luck, I'm done. And I carried on and made it to Lijiang, and on a Polish bus, which was the height of engineering in China, unless you know how different people's sense of propriety and the sort of economic lines that feed into their culture are. And nobody, knew nothing, and started hunting around for a caravan, which I never found. But I did run into a guy who was making music and invited me to a Naxi music festival. And he was the middle school music teacher. And this was an extraordinarily different kind of music, very atonal, lots of gaps and spaces in it. And he asked me, as he'd asked a couple other people, to translate the lyrics to the music into English so that when the onslaught of tourists got there, he could have something to sell. And in talking with him and working with him, I found out he was the son of a dongpa, or a shaman up there, hardly any of whom were alive anymore because they were persecuted by the Chinese communists, disappeared, worked to death, etc. But that now the Chinese government had changed its mind and wanted to get these dongpas into a dongpa center in Lijiang, and there have them translate all these old ancient sacred manuscripts that they had that would reveal their culture. And part of that culture, just very briefly, it was a matriarchal culture where everyone lived in big woman houses. And when the Chinese invaded in 1723, they bought a patriarchal Confucian model where marriages were arranged at birth and the fathers did the arranging. So they crushed the matriarchal culture of the Naxi and replaced it with a Confucian patriarchal culture. But it did not work well in that culture, and the women rebelled, and the power of the Chinese was too strong to rebel overtly, but covertly they continued to take lovers as they wished. But that meant, because contractual ties had happened between families for marriages and money had exchanged hands, if you chose an illicit lover, they both knew they had to go up to Jade Dragon Mountain, where they would live in tents with food and wine and eat and drink and have sex as much as they wanted. And then they would go to designated fields or cliff sides in the mountains to commit suicide in places where their bodies would be found, so that the Dongpa could perform the Harlan Luoko ceremony over their bodies to release them from the Yu demons of suicide, so they could join their ancestral others in the afterlife. And I'm translating one of those documents now.
Wow, that is so fascinating. And I'm to understand, so I've got some questions I was going to follow up with, but first I believe we have some images to look at that you were going to walk us through. And while we talk about those are going to be on the screen. So the list that I've got of these images, and we're going to be looking at these together, there's the big map of China. So what's interesting about this map?
Well, I think that, we live in Minot, North Dakota. China is on the other side of the world. So I think to spatially get a sense of where Lijiang is, you have to first get a sense of China. And in the upper northeastern quadrant of China is Beijing, the heart of China. And the further west and far away you get from that, the wilder and more remote China becomes. That's why all those tribal groups are pushed to the far west of China. The Han invaded, pushed them west, and ultimately up into the mountains and down into Laos and Cambodia. And there's a famous phrase, God's in his heaven and the emperor lives far away when you're in southwestern China, because Beijing's the far side there. So from China, you go down to that lower left quadrant, and from there you're in the plains of Yunnan, and then you head straight up the Mekong River, the Salween River, the Irrawaddy River. These are the great, and the Yangtze River. These are all the great rivers that originate. Their source is in the Himalayas, and then they make their way down through cultures, and cultures have grown up upon them.
What is this picture here? Jade Dragon Mountain?
Yeah, I'd mentioned that these lovers went to commit suicide in Jade Dragon Mountain because you can get lost in there. It's just north of Lijiang, and very tempestuous mountain with many moods to it. But you could get up in that mountain, and that's where they would stay for their illicit love affairs that always ended in suicide. And Joseph Rock, an ethnobotanist, was up there and has recorded himself seeing one time as many as 15 couples at a particular cliffside holding hands and jumping together. knowing that they had to die because they dishonored their family, they'd broken contractual arrangements, and so the decision to take an illicit lover was at the same time a decision to commit suicide. And they did it in secure locations, a valley, a cliff, a lake, in the mountains where they knew their bodies would be found, because if their bodies were not found, they would wander in a kind of a limbo, strange state called Louvre, where they were kind of like themselves, kind of not. Trees were there, but droopy. Everything was just in a middle, liminal reality until the Dongpa, because they found the body, goes up and begins that sacred rite.
And I've got a couple images for the Dongpa. The first one of these is called Dongpa with the Bon headdress. What is this one?
Well, we know that the Dongpas, or shamans of the Naxi people, had their origins in the 9th century Tibetan culture. And before the Tibetan culture was Buddhist, it was Bonist. And the Bonist culture has a lot of the headgear and spiritual trappings that the Dongpas use during their ceremony. And when Lamaism, which is the Tibetan form of Buddhism, took over Tibet, it kicked out the Bonist priests, who then went out into the countryside to earn their spiritual dollar further away from Lhasa, the kingdom of Tibet. And the pictographic script that you see, this little character is the character within the manuscripts for the head Dongpa himself, the shaman. But this pictographic character is Tibetan in origin, as are the manuscripts, with their long rectangular with pictographic characters. And we know that long rectangular manuscript, where you read left to right, top to bottom, is Tibetan, because all Chinese manuscripts are right to left, top to bottom.
I see.
I've been back to Lijiang 5 times since then. 2 of those times are but students from MSU, and we have worked with Dongpa Yu Deng Sita, who lives in the Dongpa Center and is a shaman, Dongpa, and he has helped me transcribe these plates, and he has chanted some of the more important ceremonial plates, manuscripts, for me to understand them.
And we have a brief time now to listen to some of this chanting of the Dongpa. So let's listen to about 30 seconds of this, and we're going to come back to this here at the end.
And the translation, once they got the Dongpas out of the wood and started helping them rather than hurting them, they had them translate the extant manuscripts. And at Kunming University, down outside of the Himalayas, they have translated into Chinese all of the manuscripts of the Dongpa that are in existence, or that aren't in European libraries, etc. So I have a copy of the Harlaluoko ceremony and others with the pictographic character, underneath of which is the IPA International Phonetic Alphabetic Sound for that character, plus the Chinese translation of that character. And with 6 MSU students in the business program, we had a cohort of Chinese students come in. They worked with me, and the 7 of us worked it all out, looked at every Chinese character and translated it into English. So I'm looking at the pictographic character, the IPA phonetic component voicing that character, the Chinese character, and then the English equivalent to the Chinese. The problem is they don't match up, because the Chinese are hated by the Naxi, they don't know the culture, and their words for some of the Naxi language is different than what the Naxi meant. A challenge.
Definitely a challenge. Robert Kibler, thank you so much for talking with us today, and we will be right back. But why? What does it do for us? The awareness of grandeur does not serve any social or biological purpose. Man is very rarely able to portray his appreciation of the sublime to others or add it to his scientific knowledge. Nor is its perception pleasing to the senses or gratifying to our vanity. Why then expose ourselves to the disquieting provocation of something that defies our drive to know, to something which may even fill us with fright, melancholy, or resignation? So I'll end with that part of the question. That is the work of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Ryan Standard, tell us, what's your response to that question? What do you think? And who is this Heschel that we're reading?
Heschel was a well-respected Jewish rabbi. He was working in the 50s and 60s. He was pretty amazing. He was marched with Martin Luther King at Selma, and just his approach to religion, at least from my Christian perspective, is that he's more of a mystic, and that he's just open to thinking about religion in such a different way. And that's what was so attractive to me when I was in seminary. I discovered and started reading him, and rather than closing down like I was feeling of so much Christian theology at the time, Heschel seemed to just open up the world. And as an artist, I think that's why I was immediately attracted to him, and still find that sense of wonder, which is really key to a lot of his work, just so pronounced, and just, I don't know, just again spoke to me at the time.
And you've made a connection then, you'd mentioned, with this notion of what Heschel talks about, the sublime, the theology of the work, and your own personal art.
Yeah, I pursue this. Our words kind of fail, but that's because it fails. It just keeps pushing us forward and pushing us forward. And to me, that's such a beautiful idea that I could find the passage, but he talks about it of mankind's never-ending symphony. You know, like it's just this always ongoing search. And one of the things that I think really relates to artists is that we tend to see the world with eyes, he talks about eyes dimmed with memory and will. We've become so familiar with the things around us, and we use these kind of mental cliches, and we need to somehow break through them to really appreciate and see the world afresh. And that's, as a photographer, that's a hard thing. And I take my students out shooting and try to say, okay, we've walked these streets before, you've maybe grown up here in Minot, but there's always something new that you can see. You just have to, it's training your eyes and your mind to think and to see what's around you in a slightly different way.
I love that idea of the sublime and the wonder, you know, that's under the threshold in that word, the grandeur, and what Heschel says about it. But I wonder, what is it that Heschel says, and what do you see as an artist that draws us to the sublime?
Well, I could read you a small passage here where he's talking about the ineffable, that which cannot be spoken. So the ineffable inhabits the magnificent and the common, the grandiose and the tiny facts of reality alike. Now, some people sense these qualities at distant intervals in extraordinary events. Others sense it in ordinary events, in every fold, in every nook, day after day, hour after hour. To them, things are bereft of triteness. To them, being does not mate with nonsense. They hear the stillness that crowds the world in spite of our noise, in spite of our greed. Slight and simple as things may be, a piece of paper, a morsel of bread, a word, a sigh, they hide and guard a never-ending secret. A glimpse of God, kinship with the spirit of being, an eternal flash of will. And then he urges us to part company with our preconceived notions. Suppress your leaning to reiterate and to know in advance of your seeing, and try to see the world for the first time with eyes not dimmed by memory or will, and you will detect that the things around you, like birds, trees, chairs, they are like parallel lines that run close but never meet. And your pretense with being acquainted with the world is quickly abandoned. And like I was saying before, I just love that idea that he's saying you can never get to the essence of a person or anything else. We only see it. What our appreciation of it is that parallel line. So we might see faces on the street, and we've seen thousands and thousands of people, but we can't get to that essence of that person. There's something that evades us, and maybe even ourselves, that there's something greater in ourselves that we can't even access ourselves.
You deal with images, the surface of things. I know you do a lot of faces and a lot of people. And what is it, some intuitive sense that draws you to some wonder that is beyond the face, that makes you seek to capture the face? Or what's your process by which you say, this image I'll capture?
That's a good question, Robert. Portraiture is actually fairly new to me. For most of my life, I've been more of a landscape and architecture photographer, and portraiture is hard for me because as an introvert, I love watching people, but actually approaching people is kind of scary. So, but I think this is a good opportunity for me, and I would go back to, part of it is my Christian theology, that as I'm looking and thinking about this theological anthropology and the worth of a person. And some of the work in my most recent show, I've been thinking about this, that as we're all continually evolving, we're growing, I don't know, there's this trying to capture something that says something about me, or in the self-portraiture, or something about somebody else. But also realizing that I could take 1,000,000 shots of one person and it's never going to get to the heart or core of something that's part of humanity.
I was meaning to ask about some of the artwork also that you'd sent, and the plate. The one that really drew my attention was the garden hoses. It wasn't necessarily the faces, but can you talk about this piece? What was your process like for this particular plate?
So when we went home during COVID, so right before spring break, I sent my students home pretty sure that we weren't going to be coming back. And when I said that we were living in an extraordinary time, and I had just, as a photo student, I told them to document whatever they were seeing, whatever they were experiencing. And because there's this universal thing that everyone around the world is experiencing it, and yet their experience of it in their home or wherever they ended up was going to be different. So I asked them to record that, and slowly these kind of stories started coming out of it. I went home and ended up caring for my 2 boys and teaching, and so trying to balance home life. And so I decided I'm going to start shooting too. And so I started shooting with my iPhone, and then just documenting daily life. And when I post on Instagram, I often call them signs of life, because they're just traces of the way my house gets destroyed in a day from my children. But they're like little traces. Like the other day, my shot was, I was reading, put my books down on the table, and then there's like syrup dripped all over the table. And so it's just catching in the light as it's coming onto my kitchen table. Otherwise, I wouldn't have seen it. And so it's these kinds of things that I'm like, oh yeah, Mathis ate his breakfast right here. That's why there's syrup. So they're just little, I don't know if you would call them still life. We read a chapter in my most recent book in class. It was called Something and Nothing. They're these daily observations of that somehow, when you frame them in a camera, they become interesting compositionally, or they say something again about daily life in my home.
I'm sorry, I just realized I was muted. It's very fascinating, and we've seen some of your previous prints also, I believe, with the Faculty Art Show in our previous episode, and we also included some of that in the montage of the music video we did with that. Did you get a chance to see that episode by chance? Not to put you on the spot.
I don't remember that, but
That's okay. Sometime we'll have to send you the link, and maybe you can,
okay.
what you think with that juxtaposition. Excellent. So also, in terms of the other pieces that you sent, what were some of the others? I think I saw, remembering the word, is it colloidal?
Collodion, yeah.
Collodion.
Yeah, so I kind of have, this year I have about 3 different bodies of work that I'm working on, and they're all very different. So there's the home COVID kind of photos. I have a letterpress body of work that I did over the summer. But for the past year and a half, I've been working on wet flake collodion. And it's a process that was developed in 1851 by Frederick Scott Archer. And it's one of the very earliest of photographic processes. It took over for the daguerreotype. And it kind of reigned between 1851 and 1880 when dry plates came in. So it's a very chemistry-based process. But it has, it's singular in its aesthetic. Nothing else looks like it. It started glass plates, and so it's a photograph on the glass. Later became more widely known through tintypes. It's the same process, just a different substrate that it's printed on. And I do both. But it's one of those really kind of fickle processes. When it's working, it's amazing, and when it's not, you're going to pull your hair out trying to figure out which of the chemistry things went wrong. And but when it works, it's such a gorgeous process. Collodion is at ISO 1 compared to the 100. So that's how much light it needs to actually make the exposure. So it has to soak in this crazy amount of light. That's why exposure times are long, or you just need those crazy flashes. I have such a broad range of interests that maybe I never get to be professional at one. I'm never an expert in one area, just have a lot of different areas. And a lot of contemporary artists, you use the medium to express what you need to say. You may not have that same expertise level that past masters would have, because they focus on one process. And I'm open to whatever it takes, whatever process I need to use to say what I want to say.
Ryan Standard, thank you again for being on the program. We appreciate your art. We appreciate your being present and talking about your craft.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we've reached that time in the program where we have to bid adieu, but we thank you for watching. And we're going to listen to a little bit more of the chanting that Robert Kibler talked about just a few minutes ago from the Dongpa. So I didn't say it last episode, so I'll make sure to say it this time. This is Minot State University. Be seen, be heard, be inspired, and thanks for watching.
Epumo a good quadi de agaja ambajini homo thai romba aruza a good bumo de so ga asamba ajeni bula ashui asamba ague monu mo cheri pani shui Adimba adinjo ague shale Raba roza ali bumo de so alo aga ji amba